Glad we can be together tonight, and I'm glad it looks like it's going to work okay. Most of us, if we've gone to a different school or a new school, we've asked people who've known something about it, what do you think? What about the teachers, the principal, what's expected in some areas? Same is true with a business or corporation. If we want a job with a new place, we try to talk to people who may know something about it. What are we getting into? I remember when I went to high school, my dad and I went together and talked to the principal. I was scared to death, and I didn't want to do wrong, but I just know we had a sit-down conversation and just kind of get some ideas as to what was expected. And when we come to the scripture, there's really no difference. And when we enter various relationships, we want to know what it's all about. And what are requirements? What are expectations? What can we expect out of it? What are some of the benefits that may come? What are some of the obligations that might be expected of me? And we have the greatest and really the only one who can tell us all about this relationship of marriage and the family, because God is the one who created us. He knows us. In this 103rd Psalm, He knoweth our frame. He remembers that we are dust. He knows us inside out. He made us. He made us the way we think, or gave us the capability to think and have free will. And all of those things He's aware of. There's not anything that we ever pass by that the Lord is not already aware of. And when we come to the New Testament, when we think about a relationship that most of us enter and sustain, marriage, the Bible has somewhat to say. And we've been going through the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. In a sense, we've been taking some chapters and just making topical studies out of them. But we want to remember that we've been in the city of Corinth, which was Paul was, which was a tremendously wicked city, immoral, and all kinds of clamoring for worldly wisdom, and there was all kinds of dishonest business dealings, immorality, pagan temples, and all kinds of drunkenness and revelry that would go on there. And Paul entered the city on the second journey in Acts the 18th chapter, and he was somewhat filled with trepidation. The Bible teaches that the Lord, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a vision and said, "Don't fear, Paul, for I have much people in this city." And he talked about that in the second chapter of the 1 Corinthian letter, that when he had come to them, he came in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And yet he did a tremendous amount of good. The first letter to the Corinthians is filled with how a church in a pagan society should operate. Problems that come up, including marriage and family. All of those things are addressed in this letter. We've been talking about the first 6 chapters, divisions over preachers, and we dealt with the church that in a sex-crazed culture, and we looked at how the church is to be a called-out body. It's to be separate, and that is emphasized even in the salutation. And their use of gifts, they had plenty of them, but Paul said you didn't use them exactly right. Religious division is a big area of thought that's really over the first 4 chapters. And then, as we mentioned, the church in a sex-crazed society. Nothing is new. The sexual revolution of the 60s and what we are experiencing now, that's nothing new. They had all that during the first century and even before. And then last week we took a little different tack, and we talked about how Jesus' teachings are so exemplified in being explained and maybe amplified, illustrated, applied, explained in 1 Corinthians as well as in other epistles. But then in chapter 7, there's a change. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote, Paul said, and then he began talking about marriage. And that's what we want to do tonight. We want to talk about marriage questions that Paul answered in 1 Corinthians 7. You might open your Bibles to that passage. But I want us to go back and think about just 2 or 3 ideas that we covered last week. We pointed out that when Jesus came to earth, he came to reveal who God was, to die a sacrificial death, and provide a perfect example that we should follow. And we also pointed out that when Jesus came, he died, he was buried, then raised, then he was exalted to God's right hand, and then sent the Holy Spirit back to the apostles. And I really want to emphasize this, that we went into a little more detail, and that is that Acts through Revelation continues, applies, and finishes Jesus Christ's revelation. I mentioned John 16, 7 through 14. I want us to emphasize one other passage in John 16. If you would turn to John 16 with me, just for a moment. John 16, 14, 15, and 16 of John deal with this lengthy speech Jesus had with the apostles when he told them, don't let your heart be troubled. I know that I'm going to have to go away, but I'm not going to leave you comfortless. I'm going to send the Holy Spirit to you. But in chapter 16, verse 13, we've emphasized numerous times that the Spirit's work would involve guiding the apostles into all the truth. He would not speak from himself, but what things soever he shall hear, these shall he speak, and he shall declare unto you the things that are to come. I really want to emphasize verse 14. He, that is the Spirit, shall glorify me, for he shall take of mine and shall declare it unto you. He would glorify Jesus Christ. The Spirit would. How would he do that? He would take of what Jesus had said, Jesus' will, which really was the Father's will, and he would declare it to the apostles. They would in turn write what we have in these New Testament epistles, and that, of course, would be final truth. So, when we're looking at the epistles, they are not to be divorced from Jesus Christ. And that was really our whole lesson last week. We talked about how Jesus in so many areas gave teachings, sometimes general teachings, and then their applications would be seen in the New Testament and in the New Testament epistles. And it's not like, well, Jesus taught on this, but Paul's words, you can't count on Paul. He's a woman hater. No. That Paul, wherever he was, or Peter, or James, or John, that when they wrote, they're simply applying and extending what Jesus wanted during those particular areas. We also mentioned in the top of the slide here, the top of the document, in Matthew 5, 31 and 32, Jesus said that you'd heard it said, whoever divorces, let him give a certificate of divorce and put his wife away. But I say unto you, that whosoever divorces his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever marries her that is put away commits adultery. And in that sense, that's what I really want us to anchor down on tonight. I want us to look at Jesus' life and teachings relative to the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And I also want us to see how it's applied in the epistles, and then hone in at the end of our lesson on 1 Corinthians 7. And see how really everything Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7 matches or harmonizes completely with what Jesus had said during his ministry. Now, before we begin, I want us to just think about these passages. I quoted to you Matthew 5, 31 and 32, and really that just says that divorce for any cause other than fornication results in adultery. And it results in adultery for one who has been put away and marries another. And then in Matthew the 19th chapter, in verses 3 through 12, we won't read the whole section, but suffice it to say that Jesus was accosted by some Pharisees, and the question was, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And essentially Jesus said, no, it's not lawful. Have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife? The real answer is in verse 6, so that they are no more two but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So the answer to the question, is it lawful to just divorce for any cause? No. Well, then they had a follow-up question in 7 through 9. What about Moses commanding to give a bill of divorcement, to put her away? And Jesus said that was because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning, it was not God's will. He allowed it for a time. But then he said in verse 9, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife or divorce her, except for fornication, and marries another, commits adultery, and he that marries her when she's put away commits adultery. And the disciples said, this is pretty tough, Lord. And the Lord said, you're right, but it applies, what I'm saying applies to everybody. So in this passage, divorce for any cause other than fornication results in adultery. He does give an exception clause, except for fornication, Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. However, it's not that in Mark. The same event, best I can tell, is under purview in Mark, the 10th chapter. And again, we'll just emphasize the passages without going into the whole context. But in Mark 10, verse 10, and in the house, the disciples asked him again on this matter. And he said unto them, whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another, committeth adultery against her. That's the second wife. And if she herself shall put away her husband and marry another, she commits adultery. He doesn't give an exception clause. So what I learned from that is that any divorce and remarriage results in adultery. That's the general rule. Any divorce and remarriage, according to Mark's account, results in adultery. One other passage that Jesus mentioned. In Luke the 16th chapter, in verse 18, Luke 16, verse 18, this is in the context, as you might remember, of Jesus talking with various Pharisees and others. And he said, every one that puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he that marrieth one that is put away from a husband commits adultery. There's no exception in that passage. So, any divorce and remarriage, subsequent remarriage, results in adultery. The one who divorces the spouse, as well as to the one or with the one to whom he subsequently marries. So when we put all that together, summarize, Mark 10 and Luke 16 give the general rule. Both teach that any divorce and subsequent remarriage results in adultery. That's the general rule. And obviously the point is marriage ought to be understood as being for life. However, in Matthew 5:31, Matthew 19, 3 through 12, especially verse 9, give an exception to the rule. So when you put all that together, if a spouse commits fornication, the innocent spouse may divorce the guilty mate for fornication and remarry without it being adultery. The guilty put-away spouse, if he or she remarries, commits adultery. I believe that's the general teaching of Jesus on this subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Now, it's applied in the letters. And if you just went through or used a concordance or just your overall knowledge of these letters from Acts all through Revelation, the application can be seen essentially in two passages. Romans, the 7th chapter, and 1 Corinthians 7. I'd like for you to read with me just the couple of verses in Romans 7. Romans, the 7th chapter, in verses 2 and 3. Now, granted, in Romans 7, Paul is talking about the fact, the overall idea, that you people who've been under the law, you're dead to the law now. You're no longer under. You're free to be married to somebody else. That's Jesus Christ. But he illustrates it with marriage. Marriage becomes an illustration. It's still true. I've had brethren say, well, it was just an illustration. Well, Jesus or Paul, nobody ever gave an illustration to establish a truth or to show a truth by using a false illustration. The illustrations were always true to prove a point and or to illustrate it. For the woman that hath a husband is bound by a law to the husband while he lives. But if the husband die, she is just discharged from the law of the husband. So that if while the husband lives, she be joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if the husband die, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be joined or married to another man. Now, a couple of things in that. Marriage is obviously for life. Paul says that. The woman who has a husband is bound by law to the husband while the husband lives. As we sometimes say in marriage ceremonies, as long as you both shall live. Do you promise to love, forsaking all others, to love this spouse, this wife, or the husband, depending on the one to whom you're speaking, in sickness and in health, in poverty and wealth, from this day forward till death do you part? And it says, yes, we do. And that's exactly what Romans 7 says. Marriage is for life. But if the mate dies, one is free to remarry. But adultery occurs when a person is married to one but bound to another, or basically married to one who is bound to another. This passage has become very explanatory of why adultery is adultery. I've used this chart before in other lessons, but I wanted to emphasize it now. A scriptural marriage is when a man and woman are both married and bound. You can marry just by going to the courthouse and signing an affidavit, do what's necessary. You're married. And it could be a scriptural or unscriptural marriage. But a scriptural marriage is one in which you're not only married, but God binds you. You're bound by God. When Matthew 19, verse 4 through 6, that we read a portion, talked about a moment ago, when Jesus said, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. That is the binding on God's part. Now, a person can be married without the approval of God. Sometimes people talk about being married in God's sight. That's not really good Bible language, I don't think. You're bound by God and married as well. So married and bound, God joined together, bound by God's law, deo, put under obligation by God, and that's the word in Romans 7. But marriage can exist, but at the same time be adultery when one has no scriptural right to the other. Hence, a person can be married to one and bound to another. And I tried to illustrate it in this diagram. Here's a person, maybe a husband and a wife, and they are scripturally married. They're scripturally bound and they're scripturally married. But then one decides he wants to divorce this mate, and it's not for fornication. There's no fornication involved. And he goes ahead and marries this second spouse. What makes this adultery is he's married to one while bound to the other. Married to this one while bound by God to the other, because the divorce was not for fornication. So we come back, and that is exactly what Paul was talking about in Romans 7. Well, let's go to 1 Corinthians 7. That's where we wanted to spend the majority of our time in our lesson. I mentioned last week, and I think if you tried, at least as far as I can do, if you tried to summarize, you take 40 verses, what is the main message of this chapter? I believe it's this: marriage is for life, and do your best with the mate you have. I believe that's the essential message. Now, he talks about a number of things. Likely the Corinthians had asked specific questions that involved difficult living conditions. He calls it the present distress. And if you'll notice in verse 26, I think therefore that this is good by reason of the distress that is upon you, namely that it is good for a man to be as he is. Now what Paul says is, if you're not married, it's better for you not to marry at this time. This has presented a lot of questions by people who usually are just beginning to study the Bible. They say, oh, I thought marriage was a good idea. I thought I read back in Genesis 2 where it's not good for man to be alone, and here God has marriage, and then Jesus talks about it, but here Paul says it's good for you but not to be married. How do you explain that? Well, I think everything has to be considered in the context that they wrote him. They wrote Paul. He says that. Now concerning the things whereof you write, you wrote, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of fornications, let every man have his own wife, let every woman have her own husband. So these are special conditions that he discusses. In verse 28, Paul says, but shouldest thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she is not sinned, yet such shall have trouble or tribulation in the flesh, and I would spare you. Yeah, okay, so he says it's better under certain conditions not to marry. However, if you go ahead and marry, you've not sinned. So what they were asking about, in this condition, is it better not to marry? Is it better to marry? And so Paul deals with that. I think in this chapter particularly, there's a need to discern between what I would call Paul's inspired advice and then absolute commands that he gives. There are obviously things that he says that are concessions, that he says, either way, you're okay. I'm just telling you that under this present distress, it's better if you do this. Verse 1 and verse 2, but because of fornications, he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of fornications, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And then verse 6, but this I say by way of concession, not of commandment. Yet I would have that all men were even as I myself. So there's a time where it would be better if you were like Paul. But then he comes back in verse 25 and says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, but I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be trustworthy. I think, therefore, that this is good by reason of the distress that's upon us. So you can tell, Paul makes it very clear that under these particular conditions, what I'm telling you about not marrying is advice. It's better. But if you marry, you have not sinned. But then there were some absolute commands. Verse 3, let the husband render unto the wife her due, also the wife unto the husband. The wife has not power over her own body, but the husband. Likewise also the husband has not power over his own body, but the wife. Don't defraud one the other, except it be by consent for a season, that you may give yourselves to prayer and may be together again, that Satan tempt you not because of your incontinency. So obviously, if you marry, there are marital obligations. The sexual intimacy is obviously here described. And he says what the husband has, the wife has. The husband has not power over his own body, but the wife. The wife has not power over her own body, but the husband. So basically he says, you give yourself up to the other. The other, and then when you combine that with verses 32 and 33, he that is married is careful of things of the world, how he may please his wife. Then there is a selflessness, a self-sacrificial giving of myself to my wife, or her giving herself to her husband. Each tries to please the other. These are absolutes. These are absolute commands. And we see several as we go through here. Well, I want us to think about the chapter. He talks about the purposes of marriage as well as obligations. One of the purposes is to avoid fornication, as he says here. To avoid, but because of fornications, let each man have his own wife. And that's one of the purposes, not the only purpose, but it's one of the purposes. And the obligations that come out of that or grow out of that are seen in the rest of the paragraph. If you, because of this distressful time, perhaps persecution, best we can tell, because of those, it's better for you not to marry. He gives some reasons later on and how you ought to have a kind of a loose hold on family, on family, because you can't know what's going to happen. Say for instance, if I'm married, or if I was living during that time, and I was in love with this girl, and I just felt like I couldn't live life without her, and I married her, and then all of a sudden I'm taken off to jail and killed. Well, Paul talks about that idea, or some of those ideas, in 28 through about 31 or 2, where he says you need to have a loose hold on these temporal relationships, including marriage. Not that you don't give yourself over to them, but you got to understand that things can happen, and you don't forego your faith because something happens to a mate. And he deals with that. So the purposes of marriage and obligations. Then there's advice given to special groups. Let's read some of these. In 8 and 9, but I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they have not continency, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn. That is, to burn with sexual desire unfulfilled. It's better, you don't want to do something that is lascivious. You don't do something, you don't commit fornication. So it's better to go ahead and marry than to burn. That's in the present tense, by the way. So he's not talking about to marry and burn in hell. He's talking about burn with and some of the newer translations translate that. So that's what he says in 8 and 9. Then in 10 and 11, he says, but unto the married I give charge, yea, not I, but the Lord, that the wife depart not. Now that's an interesting statement. I give charge to the married, yea, not I, but the Lord. That is, the Lord dealt with this in his personal ministry. And we saw that in these passages over here. That marriage is basically for life. And divorce for any cause other than fornication results in adultery. So Paul is just extending the application of this. Unto the married I give charge, yea, not I, but the Lord, that the wife depart not from the husband. Depart is a word there that comes from the Greek chorizo, which means not just separate, and because some translations use the word depart, people think, well, that's like a legal separation. It is not. What he's saying is that you don't depart as in the sense of divorce. It's the same word that's used back in Matthew 19 when Jesus said, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Same word. It's divorce. You don't divorce what God has joined together. And so, in essence, he says, if you were there at Corinth, you probably would think, well, what? Should I divorce my husband? And he says to the married, no, don't divorce. The wife is not to depart from the husband. But should she depart, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. That is the only man that she has a right to. And that the husband leave not his wife. Sometimes brethren have taken this passage to say, well, it's okay for me to divorce for a cause other than fornication. I just can't remarry. Paul says, that's not what Paul says. He says, don't depart, don't divorce. However, if there's something that happens that you do, don't compound the sin by doing something else. Let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to the only one you had a right to, or be reconciled to the husband. That's the point he made. That coincides with everything over here. It doesn't give license to divorce in a bad marriage where no fornication has occurred. You can divorce, just don't remarry. That's not what he's saying. There's a grammatical construction on this. But and if she depart. It's like, turn over with me to Galatians, the 5th chapter. I don't have a chart on this, but I'll just explain it. Galatians 5. Paul talked about this, and it's like, I would say it like this. You're talking to a teenager who's got his license. He's driving, and he likes to speed a little. And you warn him, and you warn him, don't speed. Speeding is not an option. Drive the speed limit. However, if you do speed, and you see a policeman come up behind you, don't try to outrun him, just give yourself up. Now, if you say that, are you saying it's okay to speed? Obviously not. You're saying don't speed. But if you do, and this happens, don't compound the problem by trying to run away. That just gets you in deeper trouble. And there are several passages in the Bible that have that kind of construction. In chapter 5, if I can find it without, here it is, in verse 15. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed with one another. Now, he's not saying it's okay to bite and devour one another as long as you don't consume one another. No, he says, don't bite and devour one another. Because if you do that, it can get even farther that you're consumed one of another. Don't do the first, that it might lead to the second. Or if you do the first, it could lead to the second. And so likewise, if we've mentioned, don't speed. However, if you do, don't do this that will compound the issue. Well, go back to 1 Corinthians 7. In 1 Corinthians 7, he's not saying it's okay to divorce as long as you don't remarry. He says in verse 10 that the wife depart not. Don't do it. But if it does happen, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband leave not his wife. I'm not sure what some of the questions were that the Corinthians were asking, but you can maybe listen in to a one-sided telephone conversation, get an idea. But maybe they asked, well, should we just get rid of our spouses during this distress? He said, no, don't do that. You're married for life. If something happens, though, don't remarry. Just stay unmarried or be reconciled to the only one you had a right. But then he moves on from there in verses 12 through 16, and he deals with what we might call mixed marriages, or marriages to people who are not Christians. To the rest say I, and this is an interesting idea, especially in light of our lesson last week, that the Lord gave, like we're saying here on the left-hand side of the chart, all these instructions. But then Paul comes up and says in verse 12, but to the rest say I not the Lord, that the Lord did not deal specifically with this question about, well, what if I'm married to a non-Christian? The Lord didn't deal with that completely. If any brother hath an unbelieving wife, and she is content to dwell with him, let him not leave her. And the woman that hath an unbelieving husband, and he is content to dwell with her, let her not leave her husband. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified in the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified in the brother. It doesn't mean they're saved. It just means that the marriage is legitimate. Or else were your children unclean. That would be if the marriage was an illegitimate marriage, and the children produced and that marriage would be considered unclean. But now they are holy. And so, verse 15, yet if the unbelieving departs, let him depart. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us in peace. I take it to be that here you're married to this unbeliever, and you're trying to make it work. However, if the unbeliever says, I just don't want any more of this Christianity bunk that you're a part of, and so he leaves you, then Paul says, if he departs, and that's the same word as in divorce, let him depart, let him divorce you. The brother or sister is not under bondage. That is, you're not a slave. It's a different word. It's not just a marriage bond. He says you're not under slavery to try to sacrifice your Christianity in order to salvage the marriage. You're not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us in peace. I believe that's the only explanation you could have. And the reason is because verse 16 implies that. And here's what I believe the Bible teaches on that. Here, let's say, here I am as a husband, and my wife is just getting tired of my being gone to services all the time, and she says, you just keep that up, and I'm going to leave you. I'm going to divorce you. Well, please don't do that, sweetie. I'm just trying to serve the Lord, and I want you to. I'm tired of hearing about that. And then the first thing you know, I get this divorce complaint, and she's gone to a lawyer. She's going to divorce me. And I beg and plead not to, and she's going to divorce me anyway. So she divorces me. I'm not supposed to give up my relation with the Lord and give up my faith in order to try to salvage the marriage. I think that's because he says in verse 16, look at verse 16. How do you know? How knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Don't give up your Christianity. You think that's going to save? You don't know that. So don't do that. Haven't all of us seen some of that going on? Here the wife maybe is married to a non-Christian, and it goes either way. But I have seen this where the husband says, come on, let's go to the lake. Let's go to this. Let's go to and she said, I've got to go to services. I'm just so tired of that. And so then she gives in, and she said, well, maybe if I go with him this time, he'll start coming with me more. And there's that compromise going back and forth, back and forth. Don't do that, Paul says. Even if it looks like it's going to cost your marriage, he says, let that happen, because you don't know if you'll win your husband if you give it all up. So to mixed marriages, he addresses that. And then he illustrates it in verses 17 through 24 through a couple of things, social, national things, circumcision, whether or not you're a servant or a freedman. Basically, you do the very best you can in whatever relationship you find yourself when you obey the gospel. Notice he says, only as the Lord has distributed each man, as God had called each, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all the churches. This is just not among you Corinthians. This is the way everybody ought to be. Was any man called being circumcised? You're a Jew. Let him not become uncircumcised. Has any been called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. That is, your nationality, marks of your nationality are insignificant. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandment of God. So here's your point of emphasis, verse 20, that each man abide in that calling wherein he was called. So if you're a Jew, fine. If you're a Gentile, fine. Don't try to change all these things. Your obedience to the gospel, finding yourself, you just do the best you can with wherever you've been called. Then he changes the subject of being a slave or a master. Were you called being a bondservant? Care not for it. No, even if you can become free, use it rather. For he that was called in the Lord being a bondservant is Lord's freeman. That is, if you're a slave to somebody else, you're free in the Lord. And if you're a slave to the Lord, well, he says, likewise he that was called being free, you're free. You're Christ's bondservant. You were bought with a price, become not bondservants of men. Brethren, let each man wherein he was called, therein abide with God. So I think the main point in all that is, look, wherever you, and this obviously is talking about right relationships, right spirit, he's not talking about adultery. He's not talking about something you're doing that's wrong, but in a sense here, wherever, what social, what national marks you may have, you just do the very best, serve the Lord in whatever sphere you have. Then in 25 through 40, he talks about virgins, and at that time, the father pretty much had control over whether or not his daughter would marry or not. And I think, again, the context shows that the father would have a right to give his daughter in marriage. Kind of like I think vestiges of that remain when a potential suitor for the father's daughter comes to the father and asks her hand in marriage. Sir, would it be all right if I married your daughter? I love her a lot, and I think we can have a wonderful life. And the potential father-in-law said, yes, I think that'd be a great idea. And so the father had control. I've never heard too many examples where fathers say, no, I don't think it'd be a good idea. I don't want you to marry. Hey, well, what happens then? They easily go and elope. Well, anyway, so what he says here is the father has control. And so when he says, if the father decides, I've got control over the giving my daughter away, I'm not sure I'm going to do it, then that's fine. And if he decides to give her away, that's okay, but during this present distress, it would be better if he didn't. Read these verses with me. Verse 25. Concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, but I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy. I think therefore that this is good by reason of the distress that's upon us, namely that it is good for a man to be as he is. Art you bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But should you marry, you've not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she's not sinned. Yet such shall have tribulation in the flesh, and I would spare you. That goes back to our overall thought. But this I say, brethren, the time is shortened, that henceforth both those that have wives may be as though they had none, and those that weep as though they weep not, and those that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and those that buy as though they possess not, and those that use the world as not using it to the full, for the fashion of this world passes away. That's what I'm talking about. Things can happen. Persecution can take a spouse from you. You can have your possessions stripped away from you. And so just have a loose hold on them. He that is married is careful for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. He that is unmarried, rather. But he that is married is careful for the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and is divided. So also the woman that is unmarried and the virgin is careful for the things of the Lord, and she may be both holy in body and spirit. But she that is married is careful for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Again, he's not saying it's sinful. And careful for the things of the world, that's not worldliness, but worldly obligations, physical obligations, marital obligations. And this I say for your own profit. I'm just trying to help you, Paul is saying. Not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is seemly, and that you may attend upon the Lord without distraction. But if any man think that he behaves himself unseemly toward his virgin daughter, here's a father, I don't know what to do. She's past the flower of her age, marriageable age. If need so requires, let him do what he will. He sins not. Let them marry. That not the father and the daughter, but let him give her away in marriage. But he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, that is, I'm strong-willed and I really know better than my daughter knows, and I don't think they ought to marry. He hath power as touching his own will, and is determined this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he shall do well. So then he that giveth his own virgin daughter in marriage doeth well, and he that giveth her not shall do better. It's not sinful, it's just a good or better situation. And then here's a wife is bound, in 39 and 40, he's talking about usually considered a widow. A wife is bound for so long time as her husband lives. But if the husband be dead, she is free to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she's happier if she abides as she is, that is, in an unmarried state, after my judgment. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God. So here's a widow. Well, what about her remarrying? He says it's better if she not marry. However, if she does, especially considering all these distressful things that are going on, she needs to marry in the Lord. She needs to marry Christian and not be overtaken in all these other matters that she would have to deal with. Now, I want us to think about some other questions real briefly and some lessons I think that we can learn. In 1 Corinthians 7, a God-approved marriage is between one man and one woman. It rules out polygamy. Let every man, singular, have his own wife, singular. Every woman, singular, have her own husband, singular. And furthermore, not only does it rule out polygamy, it obviously rules out same-sex marriages. And that goes back from what Jesus said in Matthew 19. When they asked him about, here we go, Matthew 19. Is it lawful for a man to put away his... Have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female? It's not that difficult. But in our society, don't let anybody say, well, God wants us to love each other, and so if I feel like I'm in love, then that is anything goes. No, love demands that we do His will, because that's what's in our best interest. A second point is that a question that's sometimes raised is one more spiritual if he or she is unmarried. And of course, Catholics in convents and monasteries believe that you're at a higher spiritual plane if you're unmarried. But is one more spiritual? Well, really the answer is no, you're not. Genesis 2, it's not good for man to be alone, so marriage was instituted. 1 Timothy 5 verse 14, to different people, Paul said, I would, or my will is, that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the household. Marriage is extolled, is commended. And so, in the passage, house and riches are an inheritance from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. And these passages indicate that. So is a person more spiritual if he's unmarried? No. If he's unmarried, though, according to this chapter, there are fewer family obligations. I've told you before Lee and I married, I just was, scot-free. And I don't mean that in a bad way toward marriage. I'm just saying I had no obligations. I'd go hither and yon. Didn't have to answer to anybody. To have a class, it might go late into the night. I didn't have any obligations. Once you marry, you have to schedule things that coincide with perhaps children and obligations of telling your wife what's going on. And not that that's a bad thing, and I'm not condemning, I'm just saying you have other obligations. All of us know that. However, if we're married, there's a better perspective of God's view of us, especially if you have children. That happened at least to us, that you really get more of a view of God, of how God views us when you have your own children. And even marriage itself is supposed to be the picture of like the Christ is the groom and the bride is the church, Ephesians 5. In the Old Testament, God is the husband, Israel was the bride. And so we get a little better perspective of God's view. The point I'm making, that in each situation, whether we're married or unmarried, we can use each area of life to its fullest and do service for the Lord. Another question, can I divorce for a cause other than fornication if I don't remarry? I mentioned that a little while ago. The answer is no. Jesus said, what therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. I don't have on the chart, but we have all kinds of obligations to meet. Support of our spouse, if we're a man, loving our spouse, children, obligations there, intimacy, obligations all across the board. And somebody says, well, it's okay if I'm divorced, if I just don't remarry. Well, what about all those obligations that go in marriage that you're abdicating? That's not right. And so the answer is no. And we've already been over 1 Corinthians 7, 10, 11. The word let her depart, or if a wife departs from her husband, is from chorizo, to separate, to leave, and it's used of this sense of divorce in those passages. And if my non-Christian spouse leaves me or divorces me due to my Christianity, may I remarry? Well, we've answered that. No. Chapter 7, verses 15 and 16, those passages do not indicate that remarriage is a possibility. He said, just don't give up your Christianity because someone is going to divorce you due to that. One is not to sacrifice his or her faith to try to salvage a marriage. The passage does not allow one to remarry. It is not an additional exception to the rule. Now, I want to end on just a few practical matters as well as the other practical matters. Jesus' teaching on all of this and its applications and explanations in the epistles should do a number of things for us. It ought to cause us to insist on teaching on the subject positively and forcefully, especially among those not yet married. Especially those who not yet, not that those of us who married don't need it. We need to know all the Lord said about it. But before younger people especially enter into marriage, they need to know the significance, the lifetime commitments that are a part of all of this, and insist on teaching on that. A second thing is it ought to cause us to behave ourselves in such a way that our mate would never consider divorcing us. Love our mate as the Bible teaches, where we wouldn't even consider somebody else because this mate knows me in and out. This mate has been with me in the rearing of her. This mate has been with me and through thick and thin. That I wouldn't want to look at anybody else. That's how we ought to behave ourselves, because of all the obligations that are there as well as the benefits that go with it. It ought also to alarm us as to the great difference between the prevalence of divorce and remarriage in our country and the looseness in sexual matters versus Jesus and the apostles' teachings on the subject. His will makes us different. I think all of us know that most of the time you can talk to some friends who are in the world, you won't go hardly anywhere and you'll find a divorce. And 1 Peter 2 says we're an elect race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, that we've been called out of darkness into His light, and we should show the excellencies of His grace. It ought to remind us of our spiritual relation or our marriage to God. That God made marriage so we could view ourselves in the relation with Him. And last, it ought to remind us that God's will on this, as well as every subject, is for our good here as well as hereafter. God does not intend, when Jesus gave all these statements that we had on the chart a while ago, God does not intend, I just want to make you miserable and hemmed in and I just have it in for it. No, that's not it at all. But rather, he that would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, his lips, let him turn away from evil and do good. For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, his ears unto their supplication. These are for our good. In Deuteronomy 6:24, even the law, he said that the commandments this day are for our children, for our good always. And so we need to keep that in mind. That all of this, as David led us in the singing of of this. When love is in the home, what wonderful bliss and happiness and joy that can come when we're all trying to do what is right. Now, you know, it takes two to marry. It only takes one to divorce. When both are working harmoniously together to try to serve God and please one another, serve the Lord, help each other go to heaven, then that makes it a glorious thing. But when you have one trying to do that and the other is not really sold on it, he's not bought in or she's not bought in, then you have difficulties. But you can still do right. You can still go to heaven. And Paul's letter to the Corinthians, a whole chapter is given over to some of that idea. This is when difficulties arise, this is what you do. God wants us saved eternally. The Lord died for us that we might be saved, and we can make it. If there's anything we can do to help you, perhaps there's something amiss in life that needs to be confessed, or any of us who need to be baptized for the remission of sins, we stand ready to help you as together we stand and sing the song.